say less. I'm back in that bag again. Yeah, yeah. Oh, say less. I'm back in that. Yeah. What you doing? Yeah, yeah. I'm back in that. Hey, where you going? Hey.
No, I just realized something about that video. That shows all 6 of the casters, but like 2 of those guys are never on this waiting room. Like Inbound's never here for those ones. Frog's never here for those ones.
Gotta drag them in.
And they're on the schedule too. They're just so lazy.
Yeah, and now Goremiser's not even here for those ones because it's me, J-Mac, taking over because Goremiser is out this week. Welcome into the SPL waiting room, your one-stop shop for all things Smite Pro League related. And we had some really fun matchups this past week, and we had a lot of roster changes that went into week number 4. And now we can talk a little bit about some of the changes and some of the results of those changes more than anything. By the way, I'm Mifflin. Trelly joining me here as well as we can kind of start breaking things down. So now that roster locks are in, no teams can make any changes from this point onward unless emergency circumstances happen. For some reason, let's say a player just absolutely cannot be a part of the league anymore for whatever. So now that rosters are solidified, we can kind of talk about some of the matchups that did happen with those roster changes this week. The first one that I kind of wanted to bring up here was the Gladiators and their matchup. They only had a single match this past week, and it was against one of the top teams in the Ferryman. Not an easy one when you make a roster change as much as they did, not only bringing Jengaru into the team, putting him in mid and moving Snoopy over into the duo lane this time. But Jengaru himself actually looked very strong this week, Trelly. I mean, It ended out, as a 1-3 match between them. Ended with a 2.31 KDA for himself. I think Jengaru really showed that he can stand a test up against the big boys.
Yeah, no doubt. Not only did Jengaru look good, I think Snoopy looked a lot more at home in duo lane as well, which, begs the question, why wasn't he just cooking over in duo lane the whole time? But they've got a mid laner now, and I think Jengaru has shown that not only can he hang, he can be a hard carry for this team if they need him, which, considering they haven't found a win yet, they definitely do. They didn't need someone to come in and just sort of coast, right? They needed someone who was going to thrive, and that's something that we've seen so far in their one matchup.
Yeah, and I think Jengaru did something that we don't often see from new players to the league, especially if they're stepping up into the SPL for the first time, which is being willing to do something.
Yeah.
Being willing to play aggressive. So often we see players jump up to the SPL and they're like, all right, first few weeks, I'm just going to acclimate. I'm trying to get used to the temperature of the water here. I'm just going to hang out in lane. I'm not going to win us a game. I'm not going to lose us a game. Jengaru's taking fights on tower line, making early rotations. I thought really good fit for this team, and having spoke to Kirmi in the past as well, I said, hey, I really like playing with him. He's a guy that's really good for our morale, so I expect growth from the Gilded Gladiators, but also I'm not on the same wave as like all of Reddit seemed to have been, or all the analysts, or all of Twitch chat at the time. That was a win, but it was gifted. Like let's be honest, the win they got dominated for 24 minutes. Fire Giants pulled. They get a wipe on Fire Giant. It was a disrespectful Fire Giant pool, and then they close out the game from there. Maybe a different version of the Gilded Gladiators doesn't even have the wherewithal to go for that play, but even then, I think we still are in the growth period, and I need to see a little bit more.
And I think, honestly, just kind of speaking on the Gilded Gladiators, that's where some of their wins have come this year, is teams that have just kind of disrespected and say, oh, you're the 7th or 8th seed team. We don't really need to take these matches seriously. You think back to, I believe it was their first win against the Camelot Kings in phase number 1. Camelot Kings tried to go for a super greedy play, said, okay, we're going to sit right here at their speed buff, see whoever walks in. Oh, we didn't kill whoever walked in. We got team wiped. You'll lose the game, and then they lose the set immediately after. So maybe a little bit of respect needs to be shown over towards this team. Talking about the Camelot Kings, is actually going to be one of their matchups this week, is the Gladiators and the Kings. That's the very first one over on Friday. 2 matchups that will be ahead of time for the Gilded Gladiators to really kind of get that test for Jengaru now, for Snoopy over in the duo lane. I do agree. I think that Snoopy looked a lot more comfortable in the duo lane. Still was putting up, I would say, at least KDA-wise, similar levels of performance that he was over in mid. But it is all about that comfort now. Instead of, piling the mages, sit back, pump out a ton of damage from long range, still can kind of do that with basic in-hand damage.
Doing it on Hunters now.
Yeah, going back to Hunters, which I think, being the old head in Smite, kind of like seeing Snoopy back in the Hunter role. That's where I grew up in SPL watching in that regard. But had some other changes that did come this week for roster change-ups. Eldritch Hounds lost Vapor's Coast, put Stewart over to the role. I think our biggest question was, how is Stu and Neil Ma going to kind of hold up now with this duo lane? and it wasn't as promising for this duo lane as compared to some of the other changeups there. An 0-3 loss for the Eldritch Hounds up against the Camelot Kings Mifflin, only about a 1.07 KDA, I think is what I ended up calculating for Stu. Wasn't the strongest performance out of him. It kind of looked like we were seeing that return to Stewart of, well, I'm not going to win this lane, but I'm not really going to lose this game. And we didn't really see any kind of real aggression come out from Stewart this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? And it's something we've talked about with Stu in the past, is that at times, if he doesn't feel like it's going to be a winning game, or if he doesn't feel like it's a winning situation, he will KD save a little bit. He won't go for these really risky plays. He's not going to run it down in lane. He'll generally hold his own, and I think that is a worthwhile play style for certain teams. It's not exactly what the Hounds needed, so we'll have to see a little bit more. I'm sure it's a discussion that they had going into this week. Hey, man, let's get a little crazy. Like let's start throwing our lives away, and maybe we get a kill, maybe we get a purple buff invade, or maybe we lose a little bit faster. But here's the thing: going down 3-0 doesn't really matter. It's only up from there. So I'd like to see a good deal more from Stu, because we know he certainly is capable of playing up at the higher levels, being that playmaker for his team, at being an aggressive style ADC. Just haven't got a massive chance to see it just yet. Maybe that has to do with Neoma and how they've meshed together. Maybe it's just a little bit of nerves playing with a new team. It's hard to say.
What about you, Charlie? What did you think about maybe Stu this week, or maybe at least what you would like to see from him in his next couple of matchups?
Yeah, it's just when you think of Stu and Neoma together, that is not a dual lane to me that screams that they want pressure. They're going to look to play through dual lane, and they're going to get active. When you think of, just for example, Coast and PBM, that's a lane in my head that I'm like, yeah, they're getting pressure. They are fighting you at level 2, level 3. They're invading your buffs if they can. Like that's their play style. Whereas Neil and Stu, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with playing passive if your team has win conditions elsewhere. It just seems like so far the Eldritch Hounds haven't really established those win conditions. So they kind of needed something more from the duo lane, which they're not getting yet. Doesn't mean it won't be there. It's just, something we say a lot about these roster changes is there's going to be a growth period where the Hounds have to decide, amongst themselves, hey, are we looking for pressure in duo? Do we want to play up? Or are we just leaving this alone and hoping that Oath and Benny can just get something active elsewhere? Are we hoping that, Ducky's going to pop up in solo lane? Because so far, it doesn't seem like dual lane's going to be that win condition for them.
Yeah, if you want to talk about a period of growth and teams that you really are going to have to put the real test towards, next couple of matchups for the Eldritch Hounds are not going to be the easiest ones either. Styx Ferryman's going to be their first matchup this week, and then the Atlantis Leviathans immediately after that over on Sunday. So a couple of tough testers for the Eldritch Hounds in week number 5. Similar for Gilded Gladiators, they got to play the Kings and the Ravens this coming week. And then, alluding a little bit to what you were talking about with Mike and Coast, Vapor's Coast now over with the Jade Dragons. Definitely the most promising look out of all of the changes. Maybe this was one that we kind of talked about last week, which was this is the only roster change that was willingly decided. No other teams were forced to make this kind of a change. This is the Dragon saying, we want to make the change. We want to bring Coast over. And he looked really good this week. A 3-0 against the Atlantis Leviathans, one of the top teams in the league, falls pretty simply to the Jade Dragons. A 4.4 KDA roughly for Coast in his first week over with the new team. Mifflin, this feels like a brand new Jade Dragons team.
I mean, and it really is just that willingness to play through the duo lane. I think we're back at it now. Whereas the Jade Dragons previously, they weren't not finding leads. They could do it pretty consistently. They did a good job of it. It just was a difficulty transitioning it into something substantiated, like a Gold Fury or maybe a team fight win. Now I'm looking at the Jade Dragons. They find their early game lead, and Vapor's Coast is leaping over walls to get involved on the on-hurl, or just landing insane snipes on the ROM, or getting aggressive on the purple buff on his own, or looking for that boxing match in lane. This version of the Jade Dragons really does seem rejuvenated, having the young, aggressive hunter player joining up with them. And even afterward, I talked to the Jade Dragons in the lobby. I told them, hey guys, when you were up 2-0, I really thought it was just going to be a 3-2 reverse sweep. I was certain of it. I would have bet on it. And then Coast walks in and is like, no, dude, I mean, that was an old issue. I fixed them. I can do that. And, they had a laugh, but legitimately, yes. I think he played incredibly well. It seems like he's happy, too. This is a change that, as you said, was the only one in that most recent wave of roster swaps that was voluntary. And they look good for it. I wish there was more nuance to the conversation, but there really isn't. I mean, blanket statement, this Jade Dragons immediately looked better.
Yeah, this was a Jade Dragons team we haven't seen in quite some time. We were starting to feel signs of it towards the end of Phase 1, then it felt like those flames kind of faded away for a bit of time. So kind of seeing this new life breathed into the Jade Dragons is a breath of fresh air for not just for us, for the fans. It kind of gives them maybe a little bit of hope for the team, because it always is kind of that worry. You see a Dragons team go up 2-0, and you always sit there, fingers crossed, like, can they at least, can they get this one? Is it going to be 3? Are we going to be going to 5? If it goes to 5, is it a reverse sweep? What ends up happening with this team? I think that at least in this first set, has kind of given us some hopes for the future for the Jade Dragons roster. Can maybe look forward to some of their future matchups as well this coming week, because we are starting to push into week number 5. And as we start hitting week 5, that means we're now only 3 weeks, and it's technically kind of like almost 2.5, because that last week doesn't have a full 3 days of play, only has a couple out there. And for some of these teams, there's only going to be a few matches. We have some teams, I believe, right now that are sitting at, I think, 7 matches played. Other ones only have 5. Yeah, Leviathans have 7 matches they've played. The Ravens have gone for 7. Gladiators and Hounds only sitting at 5. Everybody else right there in the middle at 6. So for some of these weeks, there might be a few teams that are only just going one more a pop. I think even in last week, there might even be a team or two that's not even playing a single set at all, while some of the other teams kind of catch up there. So we're getting down to the wire as we start kind of moving towards the playoffs, getting ready for Worlds right around the corner for these guys. Once we kind of get to this playoff time, I do believe that we might be in for a very competitive top 6 as we start moving forward. Maybe not as hard set in that top 6 right now, but at least we start getting closer. We've already seen our top 3. We're starting to see some of those teams kind of really fight for that 4th and 5th spot right now, and even towards where we could even see that number 6 line up to kind of get us ready to see who's going to be the 4 teams that move on to Worlds. And then, like, once they get that qualifier stage, and I believe it's in November, we don't see those guys until January. So it'll be a couple of months before we see those guys play. So I'm excited as we start kind of pushing towards there. But before we can get to that, we still have to get to next week's matchups, and we've got some pretty good matchups. Our match of the week, kind of our title match coming into week number 5, Oni Warriors and Styx Ferrymen face off, 2 of our top 3 teams right now. The Ferrymen, I will say, have not been looking like that number 1 team as of recent. Their first 4 or 5 matchups looked really strong, dominant. Sure, they're going 5 games against some teams, but still looked like they were in control the majority of those sets. So now going against the Oni Warriors, who have looked absolutely nonstop. I mean, 21, 20-minute, 22-minute games that these guys are breaking out every single week, it seems like. Trelly, what really is it for you, for this Ferryman team, that have to try and figure out what to do against the Warriors?
I mean, pretty much what I feared was going to happen ended up becoming true, and it's that, Sino's jungle picks got figured out. I think that he still is able to get value, but not as much as he was. Everyone knows, hey, he's going to go to... if we ban the Erlong Shen, no one's afraid of Bologna. They're letting that through every single time, and it's not mattering. He's not playing the Surters. He's not playing the Nikes anymore. It's just, they're just banning out the one god that he found some consistent success with, which was that Erlong, and then not really worrying about the rest. And of course, people figured out Paul can't have Baba. Those were the main issues. And I believe Baskin's Amma as well. Yeah, those are the 3 game changes, right? Erlong Shen, Amma, and Baba are not getting through, and the Ferrymen didn't look as solid because of it. So with that being said, I would hope that the Ferryman went back to the drawing board, just cooked up a couple new picks for Sino. I like the Rat, I like the Pele, but the full tank builds are not my favorite. A couple...
That Pele build is ugly.
Yeah, I mean, and Lasbra even copied it for a bit, a little bit of it, and it's still, I didn't like it on Lasbra either. He really switched up to full damage, and I think it ended up looking a lot better. So with that, I'm hoping that they go back to the drawing board, change that up a bit. If they do, this could be a completely different matchup, but as of now, I'm pretty heavily favoring the Oni Warriors just because of that. Like that is the only reason. We talk about a lot how impactful jungle can be, and the Bologna's not cutting it for me. But I feel like this conversation comes up a lot, and Sino always adapts. It takes a bit. He kind of gets stuck in his ways for a while, up until the point where it's like, he's never going to change, and then he does, and it's like a big deal. So as of now, there's a good chance that they may just let Sino roll through with these picks and change up when it comes to playoffs or something like that. But I would hope we start to see the early stages of a new god pool for Sino.
Yeah, I think the big thing right now is figuring out how to even just stop the Oni Warriors more than anything else, because this has been a team that feels like they've got to carry in all 5 roles at this point, depending on what genetics goes with. Khepri currently undefeated, I believe 8-0 on the pick right now, and not many teams are letting him get it, but whenever he does, he looks like one of the best players on the map, just because he puts so much threat to enemy players where it doesn't even feel like he has to use that ultimate very often. I think in the 2 games that we watched this past week where Genetics got that pick, I think he used it maybe once or twice, and one of those was on himself because he was the one being dove as opposed to everybody else. So I think right now the biggest concern that I have for the Ferryman is figuring out what to do to stop the Oni Warriors more than anything. And Miff, kind of the transition from the Oni Warriors from phase number 1 into phase 2, the big question was how's Genetics going to slot this team? What's he going to do different for them? Because the Oni Warriors were a very big mechanics team. They said, we're just mechanically better than everybody. We're just going to run it down. And that style won all the way up until Masters Finals, where they ended up losing to the Ferrymen, who are a team that were able to really slow down the momentum of that game. Now you jump into phase number 2. Warriors get a big shot caller with Genetics being able to now add a little bit more objective mindedness to the team. Do you think that might be the difference maker to be able to take down the Ferrymen this time?
I think it could certainly play in. And, I've spoke to the Oni Warriors and they'd said, hey, we still had that style of play available to us in phase 1. And if you go back and watch it, every now and then they would be going for these just really smart objective calls. I feel like the consistency of that has gone up a fair deal, though. The ability to just say, hey, I poked out Netroid, let's go to Gold Fury. Or, oh, we have pressure in mid, he burned his beads, they won't walk into Pyromancer, let's just take it, I think is something that we're seeing a lot more from the Oni Warriors, which is a scary thought because they're also still capable of just finding the PvP wins like we're become very used to seeing. But I think maybe the primary thing I've seen changed with Genetics is a mindset change from the Oni Warriors. It seems like they're having a lot more fun. I mean, they come into the studio, they're all smiles. They're obviously having fun bantering on Twitter. We're seeing more banter from the rest of the guys too. If Netroid's talking smack, it's just different. Or if Panatom's willing to have a little fun at the expense of the rest of the league, it's just different. Nobody else in the league is doing it like Genetics, pulling up chess matches mid game, or saying what he says and having a little bit of beef and fun with Incon, or doing God requests like on her support, and it really has, I think, rejuvenated this team and their willingness to just have fun and mess around and explore things. They explore picks pretty well, but it's not exploration for the sake of it. Whereas when I see things like Sino in Olorun Jungle, I'm like, wow, that probably didn't need to happen. When I see the on her support and I'm scared to say it out loud, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe there is some merit to that. They got a lot of pressure off of this pick for the first 10 or so levels. Is it something I want to see in ranked? No. All ranked players out there, I've seen you, I've queued a few times. Stop it. You're not him. You're not Genetics. But otherwise, I think if he were to go back towards it, I'm not just rolling my eyes and saying +1 gifted. I'm thinking, okay, maybe I should actually evaluate how this looks in the draft.
I will say, being one of the casters whenever we're not on the set, sometimes we get the luxury of being able to listen into the player booths a little bit, just from through the wall and whatnot.
They're loud.
Not only are they loud, they have a very specific pick that they've wanted to go for the last 2 or 3 sets, and every single time that it gets denied to them, you hear an uproar in the booth. And that's because Genetics wants Freya. He wants to play a Freya support when his team is up 2-0. Look, he said it before.
That's so messed up,
He said it before. They want to play.
Gonna keep getting banned because of J-Mac Tucker.
You're welcome. There you go. There's the homework for every team out there who's watching. Ban Freya if you don't want Genetics to play it when they're up 2-0 against you. But I mean, right now this is just easily probably one of the most clear-cut dominant teams in the league, one of the lowest average play times we've been seeing out of any teams out there. I mean,
they win fast.
No other team is winning games in 22 minutes or less. Before third beacon is even up to be able to be capped to this point is when these guys are already running down your Titan. But that's not the only big matchup we have coming this week. Camelot Kings and Jade Dragons will be another matchup that you definitely want to be looking out for with this one. Jade Dragons now with Vapor's Coast to the team. We already saw how strong they looked in their first matchup together, but now going against another team in the Camelot Kings. Charlie, what are kind of your thoughts on the Camelot Kings right now? They're sitting kind of at the 3-3. They've had some very hot matchups. They've had some very cold ones. Now have to go against kind of this revitalized Jade Dragons team.
Yeah, as far as hot matchups on paper, this seems like a hot matchup, but given from what we have seen, it looks like a Jade Dragon stomp to me, right? I mean,
a stomp.
I mean, that's what it's been looking like. I need to see a lot more from the Camelot Kings before I give my faith to them, especially unless, of course, the Jade Dragons that we just saw was just
the little honeymoon.
The honeymoon phase. Yeah, if that's the case, and Coast and Mike just look like they have no synergy and they're not gonna be so on point, they're not gonna find pressure, then yeah, maybe it's closer than I'm giving them credit for. But to be fair, going into the matchup, I said Jade Dragons would get washed by the Leviathans. They just had a roster change. Leviathans were the uncontested best team in the league at that point because they just took on the undefeated Ferrymen, and then they get 3-0'd. That is making a statement.
Yeah.
So I don't have much faith in the Camelot Kings given what we have seen from them recently. I hope we get a revitalized Camelot Kings. There has been like Twig pop off performances again. Variety's been looking a lot better, which was one of my big issues, was that Variety was getting camped a lot. And not even getting camped a lot. People get ganked. But Variety almost always dies to these ganks. And I think like imagine, you know how when Sot in his prime a bit ago, like I'm not gonna say he's not in his prime, but
Just turning around
he
the
would just
ganks.
turn around ganks. He would live to ganks, laugh at you, and it seems like every time a jungler shows up, Variety is dead. And I don't know if that's a positioning thing. Maybe it's team comms and he doesn't know he's there. Point being, we are starting to see Variety play a lot more clean. He's not getting camped as easily. He's not dying as easily. These are good, but to beat some of these top end teams, all that needs to be ironed out like a while ago. So I still think I favor the Jade Dragons pretty heavily, but it's not as if the Camelot King cannot play up to that level. They just haven't been recently.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've been noticing for teams against the Camelot Kings has consistently been banning against Captain Twig, specifically taking the Lancelot. That's almost always been in those top 3 bans. But we finally saw him kind of flex away from it. He got to play it a couple of times in their last set, but finally flexed away from there and went back to the Hunbats, which is his most played god competitively. It's the one that he has the most time on. And he looked really good on the pick, Mifflin. It's been a while since we've seen Captain Twig kind of return to that style of form. He may not have had the most impressive slash line at 3-3-3, but the level of control he was able to add to the team, giving that immediate level 5 threat, really felt like we were starting to get kind of a bit more of the older Camelot Kings, the ones that were willing to take those team fights. Sure, we might not win the early game, but as long as we're somewhat on pace and have some momentum and somebody who can just press a 4 button and have a major impact in a team fight, it really looks strong for the Camelot Kings.
Yeah, and I think that's almost indicative of some of the wider sweeping changes we saw last week. Speaking to what you're saying, Variety dies to ganks so often, I think, because of his mindset. Variety seems like to me the type of guy who's like, I'm not gonna back up in my lane. I don't. This guy didn't beat me. I'm not gonna lose this 1v1. It's not a 1v1, buddy. It's a 5v5, and the jungler is gonna show up, and you just used everything in this skirmish that you weren't gonna kill this other guy in ever. So we've seen a little bit of that reeled in. Feels like Variety doesn't feel like he needs to be the one pushing the team forward anymore. So he's taking a little bit more of a chill laning phase, just grabbing totems, this, that, or the other. I think Twig getting back to some of his classics is important.
Oh, yeah.
We saw the Thor recently. We've seen some of these other more hyper carry style picks. Not exactly Captain Twig's MO, as far as I'm concerned. I even spoke to him at the Season 8 after Worlds. I said, hey, man, your Hunbots is like the best Hunbots in the league. I want to see more of it. And then he waited till Season 10 to like.
Then he said, what about Thor and Earl?
Yeah, what about Thor and Earl? I said, what about him, bro? But I think the Camelot Kings have seen improvement in the roles that I had called for. I believe it was 2 waiting rooms ago. I said jungle and solo need to step it up, primarily in the jungle. I understand a lot of the things that are slowing Twig down are off the field. Just having a kid, dealing with any other issues, or having to be present there, obviously going to eat up some of his time and ability to think about Smite, but we have to evaluate his ability to play it, and as of recent, has been looking a little bit better as of most recent, but if we're going over the last 4 or 5 weeks, hasn't quite been there. So good to see that. Need it to be a trend. Want to continue to see Twig going towards his bread and butter. Otherwise, the Camelot Kings have also been playing on and this is not a paraphrase, this is a quote from Big Man Tings, who just spoke to him a moment ago, on hard mode with some of their picks. They're the only guys going towards things like Vulcan and stuff like that. They haven't exactly fully adapted to the I'm going to run it down mid lane meta. I'm not seeing the most Raijin. I'm not seeing the warrior assassin mids, things like that. So maybe the Kings a bit stuck in their ways, trying to find what worked for them in the past and then building on it. And I think that's an okay idea because of how much time we have until Worlds. But I would like to see them playing a little bit more in line with what everybody else is playing too.
Yeah, because the most important part for these guys is, once the regular phase is over, top 6 move on to that playoffs, top 4 from those move on to Worlds, and then those teams that don't make Worlds or don't make that playoffs, you don't see any gameplay from them as far as competitive until January, until that final last chance kind of qualifier. So for some of these teams, these could be their last few weeks for 2 months before we ever see any kind of competitive play from them again, especially the two teams that are kind of at the bottom. And one of the teams that's at the bottom right now, but could be on that upward trend, the Gilded Gladiators. They're got 2 matchups this week. Didn't want to highlight necessarily the Kings Gladiators matchup if we were talking about the Kings and the Dragons. So Camelot Kings get a little bit of a warm up to play against the Gladiators before that Dragons match. And for the Gladiators, their second match of the week on Sunday is up against the Highland Ravens, another team that's kind of been in that hot and cold, maybe not quite to the extremities of the Camelot Kings, but it's been a team, Charlie, that we have seen some really strong highs from, some really low lows, but it feels like their kind of middle points, their little plateau points have been a little bit higher than the Kings as of recent.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think because we talked about the top 6 is still very competitive. I don't know who I'm giving 6 or 5 to at that point, probably more towards the Ravens. But I expected a lot more from this roster towards the beginning. I guess they're still, replacing Berra is definitely not something that's going to happen overnight. You know what I mean? That is going to take some change-ups. And it's not like Zapman was going to fill that role all that differently than Berra anyways, right? I feel like their play styles can be very similar. Berra definitely had pop-off moments where he would be able to step up, get a solo kill, carry his team, and just, like Apollo in the back line and just, kill 3.
Talking about season 1 right now.
I'm just saying, hey, man, I'll bring him back to Worlds. He was Donza ulting it, whatever you want to call it. The point is, that wasn't like this big dynamic change-up that was going to completely rewrite the Ravens' gameplay mechanics. But I know they've got a lot of great minds on that team. I know that if nothing else, Hurrywin and Ven are cooking up new strats daily. They're probably in a Discord call right now. Like, what if you play Alpouage and I play Zeus? And they are working on something. So far, hot and cold, as you've said, which I guess is kind of the struggle of a lot of these teams. If you're not the top 4, you're still trying to figure out your version of the meta that we are playing currently. But to J-Mac's point about, you got to start looking at placements, right? You have to start looking about realistically how high can you get, because being in that last chance qualifier, being in that bottom end of the bracket leading up to Worlds is scary. 2 SEC teams made it to Worlds last year. You don't want to be one of those guys that's fighting for your spot against some of these young guns.
No, I definitely agree to that, Tesman, especially with how strong the EU SEC and specifically looked last year, with how strong they've been looking this year. We'll get to see kind of how they face off with the NA a little bit later on, kind of in the years we get to that point. But Mifflin just kind of bringing up the Highland Ravens and at least the remainder of their path for at least this regular phase. They've got the Gilded Gladiators this week.
Favored.
And then after that, next week, they've got a match against the Hounds, and then they've also got the Leviathans as their final matchup. So currently looking at least standing wise for some of these teams out here, Highland Ravens are at 3-4 with their final matchups. On expectations, probably looking to finish 5-5. At best, can finish a 6-4 for themselves. And kind of that same division with the Camelot Kings, 3-3, Oni Warriors, 5-1. For the Gilded Gladiators, unfortunately for them, probably their best chance is just to have a good fight against the SEC, because they would have to win out not only all 5 of their next matchups to jump up a seeding,
unlikely,
but they would also have to bank on the Ravens losing out on their matchups the remainder of the way there to have a better chance at it.
Likely.
And similar for the Camelot Kings too, to be able to only win at best 2 of their next 4 matchups, and then still hope you have the better head-to-head there. It's similar sides, at least the standings for the Eldritch Hounds. They're currently at 1-4, but maybe a little bit of extra hope for them. Jade Dragons and the next one's up at only 2-4 at the time, so bit more chance for standings jumpings that direction. Not quite so much for third up and beyond there into second and first, because there's a 5-1 and a 5-2 Ferrymen and Leviathans immediately above. So as we start getting to these final weeks of standings, every single match even more important than the previous ones, making sure that you win those out of division matchups, because you only have the one time. Getting those in division matchups also, especially against the lower seeded teams with the Hounds, the Gladiators, and I guess I also do technically have to say the Dragons, since they're not really getting those big wins just yet, and making sure to get those wins are so important for these guys. Is there anything, at least for, I'll kind of throw it at least towards the Gladiator side, anything you would like to see improve from this team now moving into their final match? Just everything.
Yeah, like the copy pasta, like team fighting, objective play, early game, mid game, late game.
They got early game sometimes.
Or they got early game sometimes. Sure. Are they doing a lot with it?
Well, that's what I'm saying. So maybe like mid game,
Yeah. So
maybe leave early game out of it sometimes.
Look, I think the Gilded Gladiators are a lot of very talented players that could all play their roles, circles around anything I could do. Obviously, are they hanging with the rest of the league right now? I don't really think so. When I look at each one of the roles, am I thinking, do they have a top 3 player in any individual role? I don't really think so.
I mean, they're uncontested 8th at the moment, yeah.
Uncontested 8th. As far as things that need improvement, it's everything. I will say we have seen some improvement. I think the changes that they made recently should create the space and headroom so that if they do have growth periods, that they can still play around it, sure. Is Snoopy's going to have a higher ceiling in ADC? I sure hope so. Is Jangaru going to have a higher ceiling in mid than Snoopy did? I sure hope so. If that's the case, amazing. I will say, and I don't like having to say it, considering he is still one of the newer players to the league, Kana really stunk it last week. It was a very poor performance there, especially considering the play style he was aiming for. Because I think there's a difference if we see Kana come out swinging and he's like taking fights in lane and it's close and he dies every time and he's 0-7, but all 7 times he almost knocked down Baskin, or he got ganked or something. Sure. I saw him try and play passively in lane, just hang in there, wait for the rest of the team to do what they got to do, and he couldn't. He just got soloed out, poked out, 4 levels down, loses tower at 9 minutes, and it happened every game. Can't have that be a continuing trend.
No, we have seen a pretty harsh downward trend, at least for Kana, from his time in the SEC, jumping to SPL. And this is a player, I mean, we watched him jump up into the world stage last year, looked really strong. We were sitting there going, man, Kana for SPL, that sounds really good. Like, this is
I said it for sure.
This is the next up guy for SPL, but I don't know if it's a product of the team that he's on at the moment, so maybe he's not quite comfortable with the squad. Maybe he doesn't have the same level of confidence as he did when he was playing with his EU team back in the SEC, but we haven't seen that same spark from Kana just yet. I mean, even looking at his previous 6 games, he's only had 1 that he's gone positive, and that was in a loss against the Oni Warriors where he went 4-1-5. After that, 0-6, 0-3, 0-2s, a 1-3 game in there. It has been a tough time for Kana, but he has been camped pretty heavily over on that side of the map, so maybe some credit given that way that teams are saying, hey, maybe this guy could be the strong factor on the squad, so we need to camp him. But he hasn't really shown that he's that strong factor that necessarily needs to be camped out. We've seen a lot of teams still put focus towards Kirmi, towards Jake, making sure to keep those guys down and really keep this Gladiators team from being able to jump up there. Again, another team that is sitting there at the bottom that we mentioned, Eldritch Hounds. Trelly, is there anything for you on kind of the improvement for the Hounds now that they've got Stewart on the roster? Is it really just honing in this dual lane, or is there other aspects of this Hounds team?
No, I truthfully don't think that they want Stu to be that hard carry for them. I think as long as Stewart is staying like even in lane like he usually does, that should be filling out what they're asking for. It seems like from the Hounds teams that I've been watching, they want Benny Q to hard carry, right? Like that is what they are expecting, or at least playing for. Trying to get Oath involved with Ducky if possible. If that lane's dead, okay, now I'm going to sit in mid a lot and try and find just AFK farm. If you guys are losing a fight over at Gold Fury, Oath's going to go split push. He's going to try hit level 20. Let him carry through. Pushing. And I'm not sure if that's going to be a consistent trend. I would love to see a different mindset switch up here for the Hounds, because you can't count on your mid laner to carry every single game. It's not always going to work. There's plenty of other mid laners in the league that can match Benny's pressure, that can play at that level as well. You need to diversify your carries a bit. Ducky has had those pop-off performances, but there's a lot of ganks that come his way as well. I think if it were me to try and level up this team, I would say that, yeah, Neil and Stu have to get a little bit more aggressive. They can't just sit back. They have to try and, go for some cheeky invades, go for some 2v2, send Oath over. Instead of just going for the shield camp and running away like we've seen him do 1,000 times, maybe try and go for a cringe game. Even force it if they know it's coming. Something like that. When you're essentially tied for 8th place or 7th, 8th, whatever you want to call it, there's almost no bad plays, right? Like you got to try something.
Yeah.
Just sitting in lane and doing nothing isn't going to work at this point. Your placement is not going to matter anymore unless you're really thinking you're going to win out, which I don't think anyone really, you hope for it, but no one is counting on that. It's time to just start making some crazy plays and try and force some things.
Yeah, I mean, a win out for the Hounds would mean to beat out the Ferrymen, the Leviathans, the Dragons. Then they've got the Ravens and the Gladiators on the opposite side. So still a tough schedule for the Eldritch Hounds and a tough schedule for the remainder of a lot of these teams. But That's it, kind of talking about week number 4. We still got week 5 coming up. That's going to be starting up tomorrow on Friday if you are tuning in live. We hope that you'll be over there. Make sure to follow us on SMITEPro at Twitter. Also, if you're already here on the channel and you're not already following the Twitch channel, do so. And for the YouTube channel, for people who are watching it over on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. Week 5 is going to be a very exciting week with only a few more to go here in the Road to Worlds. Make sure that you do not miss out on any. On behalf of myself, Bifflin, Charlie, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you at the SPL for week 5.